Hello, everyone, and welcome to the IDEAS seminar series. Um, this IDEAS stands for Informed Democracy and Social Cybersecurity. The talks that we're having in the seminar series span the gamut from, tracking down who is spreading disinformation online to talking more about the policy and what kind of policy changes should we have in the future. For those of you who are interested in giving a talk or have someone you'd like to suggest to give a talk, please send me email about that. Today, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker. Our speaker is Zeerak Waseem, coming to us from the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. Zeerak is a computer scientist who once said that what he really enjoys about computer science is the people, how we can influence their lives in positive ways through the use of computers. He has a strong interest in a large variety of areas in computer science, particularly in natural language processing, and uses these to understand a variety of things, including what is going on in social media. In his work, and in his work, he has been looking at issues of online abuse and incivility, and looking at ethics from a machine learning perspective. His work addresses how you can robustly detect abuse across the different platforms, looks at the socio-lex within these and the dialects. His research basically is think of it as our favorite kind of computer science, applied stuff to the real world, looking at hard problems, particularly from a social human perspective. That is exactly what he'll be talking about us. For those of us in this community, this talk is particularly poignant today because we are in remembrance of the Tree of Life shooting last year. So it is a special meaning to our community today. Thank you. And with that, I turn it over to Zeerak. Zeerak, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you for that very thorough introduction, specifically including things I'd forgotten I had said. One brief note is that I'm going to join the Digital Democracies Institute at Simon Fraser University, which is why my slides have the DDI logo on them. But we're concerned, that is concerned with a lot of the same things as this IDEA seminar seems to be. Another thing I want to start out with is I tend to find discussions much more rewarding than talks. So please feel free to jump in, and I'm going to try to keep it fairly short so we can have a longer discussion. Now with that, if my computer will allow me, yes, there we go. So abuse detection has been getting a lot more commercial and research attention because the world is in the state the world is. And in this talk, I'm going to start by talking a bit about the computational things, and then I'm going to go down to talk about how we talk about the issue of abuse and toxicity matters and its downstream implications. And then I'm going to talk a bit more about what I believe to be that this is fundamentally a question of political capital and oppression. So a lot of the focus on abuse has been around cleaning up content, and that there's an impediment from that there's a societal impediment that we clean up these networks and these social media networks. And to start with, I'm going to talk a bit about how we model it, and both what the goals were, but goals are what the realities then turned out to be, and what steps we might be able to take. So to start with the goals, I'm going to focus here on the not abuse detection in general, but specifically on hate speech and offensive language. One of the reasons I'm doing this is because of cyberbullying, which has very different goals and user groups, where abuse detection, where hate speech and offensive language detection tries to act in a generalized space. Cyberbullying is very often focused on children and their needs for protection and safe spaces. But in the context of hate speech detection, one of the first goals for most people designing these systems and doing this research is protecting marginalized communities from and people from abuse. Um, and there are some issues here, but the way that I'm going to go through this, I'm first going to go through the imaginaries and the ideas that we had, pedal through them, and then go over to what then actually happened. The second goal that a lot of us had is really derivative of the first one, which is we want to encode ideological positions into label data. And the reason that that is derived from the first one is that we can't talk about marginalization and marginalized communities without also having some notion of what that means. The third aim is a lot more computational. We want to understand the different forms of abuse and not rely too strongly on token occurrence. So we want to make sure that the N-word, for instance, is not necessarily penalized as, it's not necessarily seen as abusive, but it's only seen as abusive in the context of people who are not African American or who are not Black using that word. The realities, however, differ a little bit, differ a lot. So to start with the first one, the very communities that we sought to protect and we sought to create these technologies for, we end up penalizing through, and we're going to get more into why that is over the next slides. But to understand, but the consequences of this, of our choices, have been that we end up relying on dominant discourse notions of what respectability is. So that means that queer communities that use the B word in a positive or in a reclaim manner might be are more strongly moderated by automated systems than, for instance, white supremacists who say things that have a lot more social harm and sow social discord. In the second aim, something happened along the way, because we realized, like in modeling and doing abuse detection, we realized that labeling abuse and sitting in front of it for however many hours can have some real harms on the annotators. And to try to balance that, a lot of work started going through saying, well, we're going to crowdsource this data, because if we have more people looking at it, we don't need as many people. But tying this back into encoding ideological positions into our data, this actually means that we have worse quality data because of a lack of consistency in annotation and because people operationalize it differently. So the primary groups that are annotating data on Mechanical Turk, for instance, reside in South America, in South Asia, and in North America. Now, these are three places that have very different understandings of what abuse and hate speech might be. And naturally, even given the same guidelines, they're going to operate, people from these different geographies are going to operationalize it differently because of their local context and their local understandings and cultures. And finally, in the third aim, and this third aim is actually fairly easy to resolve compared to the other two. Because of the task of annotating data being such a harmful task, not very many large data sets exist, and not very many data sets which overload specific tokens. So if we, for instance, know that the mention of Black makes something more toxic as it does with, or lets the system think that something's more toxic as it does in the Perspective API, then obviously it would be good to add more data that is not toxic that uses the word Black. But because of both the negative and positive classes need to be balanced in this case, this is a really expensive task to do financially. And it can be a very expensive task for the positive classes, for the people doing this kind of labeling. The other issue is that we've primarily looked at surface forms of words. So we've just said that, or as the abuse detection task came along and the hate speech detection task came along, we were moving from using linear models and hand code and manually created features to using word embeddings, and now to contextual embeddings. The influence of that is that we've gone from handcrafting our features and having a very strong understanding of, or at least trying to have a strong understanding of what the problem is that we're trying to model and what we're trying to understand, to simply providing the words in their surface form. And this inherently leads the model to overfit to tokens due to simple correlations and due to their occurrence in the positive and negative classes. So this is what's happening here, right? We're going from feature engineering to surface forms and from linear models to neural networks. And for a long time, the state of the art for hate speech detection were convolutional neural networks. And the reasoning here is that models as well as humans understand that, or find that looking at a single token disconnected from all other tokens isn't going to help a lot. But looking at tokens in context with the other tokens that it's surrounded with might give you a better idea of what hate speech is and what is hate speech and what is not. And so moving towards BERT and transformers, this is obviously still possible, but just using these large-scale contextual models and as pre-trained models, and it's just adding your last layer to it, or like retraining the last layer. In a vanilla sense, does not really allow for this sort of idea, but you can, of course, stack a CNN on top of them. But there are some other issues with this this neural network and this neural network approach. So one of them is that we're working on very limited vocabularies. So as soon as we release our models out into the world, they're going to be exposed to a much richer way of using languages and much richer vocabularies. And so they're going to be limited in their functionality there. The other issue is that through relying on these surface forms, we don't really get that depth of information that we want. And when we do take more information into account beyond the data that's available, we're often relying on pre-trained embeddings and pre-trained models that are not trained on data from social media, which has two different implications. One being that they're less familiar with the rhetoric around abuse and how people communicate. But another issue is that the forms of language that are produced in Wikipedia, where BERT is trained, or which BERT is trained on, and where Word2Vec models are trained on the glove embeddings as well. One of the issues, so those types of language are very far from how minorities use language, how we speak, specifically how we speak in contrast and in opposition to oppressive regimes and oppressive structures. Moreover, these kind of contextual embeddings in these models contain biases that contain racial and gender biases according to how people speak of the specific group. So if we speak about South Asians or Pakistanis, which I am, in a negative way more frequently than positive, then the models are going to learn that, inherently, but the word Pakistani or like the identity Pakistani is going to have some sort of negative context, or it's going to carry some negative meaning. So what I've been thinking about for my dissertation, and these are some very preliminary findings, are that we need to move away from this idea of just relying on the surface form. And the way that I've been thinking of doing this is representing words as the concatenate documents as the concatenation, or representing words as a concatenation of their linguistic inquiry and word count categories, and then representing the entire document as a function of that. And so there's some really interesting things that are going on here. These are on the development set, so there's something to be said for whether this applies on the test sets as well. So far, my findings have been that this does apply on the test sets. I just don't have quite as nice graphs for my test sets. So one thing that that's interesting to note here is that by transforming away from the surface forms of words into the loop categories, we end up in a much smaller unique token space. So we, in this specific, for these specific slides, or for these specific graphs, on the right-hand side in the word, the number of unique tokens is more than 50,000. On the left-hand side, however, we end up with about 780 unique tokens. However, these tokens are much denser. They less frequently occur in, there are less tokens that just occur once or twice. The lowest number is 6. And for all 6 of these models are convolutional neural networks. But we find that the same thing applies for on different models. So long short-term memory, LSTMs, and MLPs give the same results, where we see that this radically reduced vocabulary space actually allows us to do a lot, to say a lot more, or to perform as well, or roughly as well. For recurrent neural networks, however, we find that they don't, it's a mixed bag. Sometimes they work quite well, other times they don't work at all. For these specific graphs, I've reduced the problem into a binary prediction problem of abusive or not abusive. And the reason that I've done this is that I want to be able to take the model and then cast the predictions onto other data sets that have already been labeled, that have already been annotated by human labelers. And what I'm seeing there, although again I don't have the nice graphs, and I don't have as nice graphs for them, and I'm verifying my results there for like the 15th time, but still verifying my results, is that by using these transform representations of the documents, we can predict quite well onto other data sets. So essentially what we find is that by reducing the focus away from these highly specific tokens that only occur in specific situations, like if we had a data set for anti-Semitic hate speech, then that wouldn't, just looking at surface forms, that wouldn't map that well onto, for instance, anti-Black hate speech. But by reducing away from these surface forms, we get to understand something more generally about what's happening and what kind of language is being used. And this allows us to move out and perform reasonably on other data sets. Now, obviously, it doesn't work as well as if you train a model specifically for that data set, but it does say something about the generalizability. And what this to me suggests, all of the models are very simple networks. They are as basic as I could make them. But what they suggest is that by thinking more about how we represent our data rather than having a deeper or more complex neural network can give us a lot. Can give us a lot of benefit down the line. So I'm going through my slides a bit quick, but that's only good. So the other strand of research that I want to talk about is about the politics of labeling something as toxic or not toxic. And so this work is joint work with Nana Tulstok from Copenhagen Business School. And the question we're asking in this work is, well, what is it? What do the discourses around toxicity actually mean? In this initial slide, where we had a bunch of examples of different reports on or different reporting on the internet, and where one central theme keeps occurring, which is that there is healthy and clean and toxic, and that there's healthy and clean and toxic and dirty on the other hand. But the question here is what that implies. So we return to some older literature in social anthropology, specifically Mary Douglas's work on dirt. And in her book, Purity and Danger, she argues that what is clean and what is dirty is in the eye of the beholder. And she says that the reasons for this, the reasons societies make these distinctions is to maintain structure through saying what is allowed and what is disallowed in that society. And rather than casting dirt and process of cleaning as negative removals or as a negative process, she casts it as positive efforts to reorganize the environment and to make that the environment conform to an ideal. Now, looking a bit further into the future, moving a bit further into the future, we see that Stuart Hall builds on this work. And Stuart Hall argues that cultural order is disturbed when the wrong classification is made, or an object cannot be classified into a specific group. So here he is, in the latter, he exemplifies this through mixed race folks who do not belong strictly to either group, and therefore classifying them into any one of those groups is going to threaten that group's social integrity and coherence. Moreover, Hall also argues that that a sender and a recipient need to agree on the meaning of a message, otherwise it ensues some conflict. And if we then think about how this works in content moderation and how this applies to content moderation, well, for content moderation technologies, very few words can objectively be classified into a specific group of toxic or not toxic. Profanity is the general example of this, where swearing can either be emotive, or it can be pejorative, or it can be both. But this disturbs the model's ability to classify things because these clean demarcations do not exist. And machine learning models, just like society here, needs to maintain these clean, tries to maintain these clean borders within which it can classify. So understanding that, we need to think more about how to think about context to define whether a word is toxic or healthy. And importantly, we need to think about the community that it's used in. Because if we look at the N-word as an example here, outside of the African American community, outside of the Black communities, that is unilaterally pejorative. As soon as we move inside of that community, though, or inside of those communities, we see that it's no longer so clearly defined whether it's pejorative or not. It can definitely be used pejoratively, but it is also used in a much richer sense, as Jacqueline Rahman argues. She states that it is used both to connote group identity and belonging, and that in some cases also connotes kinship. So it becomes important to ask the question of what idea it is that we're conforming to. Uh, which group is it that which group is it that we're seeking to protect, and which community is it in society is it that we're seeking to have clear borders for? As I think I've alluded to already, it's in this case for hate speech, it's very often white supremacy and white sensibility, and dominant discourses on what is dominant discourse on respectability. Thinking a little bit about Stuart Hall's idea of the sender and recipient model, we find that in the case of content moderation, we need to add a layer of complexity here, because there's a third party, either a human or a machinic content moderator, that makes a decision on a bit of content, and it very often they're presented this bit of content devoid of context. So for a Facebook comment, they might just be given, or for a comment on Facebook, very often the content moderators are just given the actual comment and need to make a decision on, is this hateful or not? Similarly, so with the machine learning or the machinic methods, they are just presented with the comment itself, and then a decision needs to be made. And the interesting thing here is that the recipient doesn't actually get to have a say here. They don't get to say that, no, this is not abusive, this is not hateful, or yes, this is hateful, because there's this external third party that's making a decision on their behalf. And very often, as we're working in the semi-public sphere, it's not just on the behalf of the recipient, but it's on the behalf of everyone who may see this bit of content. And this then becomes a question of power. Who has the power to define what constitutes toxic and what constitutes healthy when no context is given? In terms of, to take the example of Facebook, their guidelines state, or at least at some point stated, and I think still do, that hate speech against identities is not allowed. That is to say, if you were to attack someone based on saying something along, I hate South Asians, that would not be allowed. However, saying, I hate South Asian cleaners, that is allowed, because instead of going for the entire group of South Asians, we're looking at, you're then saying, I only hate the subset of this group that are cleaners. However, this is a fairly constructed way of looking at hate speech, as most people who have either experienced it or been in touch with communities that are affected by it would often tell you, is that, people often use hedging and other forms to say, well, it's not all people of this community, it's just the specific subset. It's not all migrants that we hate, it's just the lazy ones who don't work. Or it's just the ones who are undercutting employment, or like our pay. And so this speaks a bit to who has the power. This speaks a bit to who has the power to define. But very often it is North American, because most of our social media are companies that started in North America, or most of the global companies anyway. It's very often, North American white men, specifically the group of people who are least likely to have experienced racism and have experienced hate speech. And the downstream effects of this is then which bodies are police and which bodies are then residual, and which bodies do we care about and which communities do we care about protecting, and how do we base our notions of toxicity on these communities, and which communities do we seek to protect. And this brings me quite nicely to how some of this also plays on in terms of machine learning. And as I've been building up to and started out saying, I think it's time that we reconsider the political power of content moderation systems, and specifically ask who these serve. This bit is from joint work with Marika Lutz from Humboldt University, Isabel Augenstein from Copenhagen University, and Joachim Ping from Hero. So, as Donna Haraway said, no one ever accused the god of monotheism of objectivity, only indifference. In her seminal work on science communication, Donna Haraway argues that science communication often takes a view from nowhere and employs the God trick to portray ideas and findings as universal. What she's arguing here is that, or what she argues in her paper, is that the view from nowhere is not an identityless entity. It is very much embedded in social cultural meaning and situation. It simply pretends that it's not. And that through this denial, the perspectives that are embodied and embedded in context can be rejected as biased and not generalizable. But what Harry notably argued is that some perspectives are only visible from subjective positioning. And so we think about how this applies to machine learning and how this is embodied. But in the case of the N-word, if we were only take a majoritarian perspective on whether the N-word is pejorative or not, well, in that case, the N-word would be pejorative. However, to see that it's not just pejorative and to see that it has a much richer history, and similarly with the B word, if we take a majoritarian view on it, these are harmful words. But if we move into the communities that self-identify, or communities, or queer communities, where queer, of course, also used to be a slur, but it's been reclaimed, we need to look at how these communities speak of themselves and how they treat these words to make any decision on whether they are offensive or not within these communities. But as long as we only remain and look at things from outside of the community, then we're going to cast judgment on the very communities we're seeking to protect. Now, this kind of embodiment falls through in the machine learning pipelines and shows up there. And it shows up from three different perspectives. The first being the designer, I should say, machine learning pipelines are very often cast as universal. A hate speech detection system unilaterally decides whether something is hate or not. It does not take into context of the situation that it's in, or the situation that the content is in. So machine learning, similarly to science communication, takes a disembodied view on whatever it's classifying or whatever it's working on. And it does this from three different perspectives. It does this from the designer, who is seen as distinct from the system, the data which is removed from its context, and potentially, in the case of supervised machine learning, is adjudicated on very often by someone who's also removed from the context. And then in the model that is trained on the disembodied data. To start with the designer, this tends to be what is most often argued as the reason for biased machine learning and for biased methods and outcomes. Very often the designer or researcher is disassociated from the data and from the model and their outcomes. This comes through that it's very often the designer is not one of the subjects that is either going to be affected by it or even exists in the data set. And even when they exist in the data set, they very often find that the negative harms that they would face would be, and they very often find those negative harms, or those harms. And other harms are not found. And this is why a lack of diversity is so often cited as one of the reasons for bias models. And sure enough, there are very good reasons for why we should have more diverse developers and why we should have more diverse groups of researchers working on socio-technical issues. However, simply stopping there and saying, well, we need more Black folks or we need more women in machine learning or in content moderation doesn't really doesn't really consider the question of, rather than saying that it's just a matter of which bodies are in and making these systems less harmful, they don't. This doesn't suggest that we ask, well, how do we reimagine machine learning as an equitable technology, or as a technology that upholds and fights for human rights and the things that we believe in. In terms of data, or how machine learning is how data is disembodied. Well, first of all, data is very often collected and from embodied humans and then transformed to disembodied data sets. As Lisa Gittelman argued, there's no such thing as raw data. Raw data doesn't exist because it's always made, and then we apply meaning onto it. And this kind of subjectivity and meaning making creeps in through several different stages of the machine learning pipeline. Amongst these, the data sampling methods, the annotation guidelines, and the annotator selections. Moreover, the moment that we've gone through this entire process of sampling our data, annotating it, or selecting annotators and annotating it, well, then we have these annotators assign some labels to them. And as we went over before, these labels are still just subjective positions on whatever the concept is, or for hate speech. So whether a word is hateful or not. And again, for hate speech, these kind of subjective truths, because we take a majoritarian point of view on things, very often encode dominant discourse perspectives on respectability. But beyond, and like a similar issue is seen with machine translation systems, where like a label, like a translation from English of the word doctor to German will very often be asked, which is the masculine form. And that's not necessarily wrong. Men can be doctors. But if that's the default for a system to do, then we end up erasing all the women or asked in who are also doctors. And that's obviously quite harmful and has some ramifications, or has some quite serious ramifications. And we need to think more about how we treat these subjective truths, because a label is not necessarily wrong, but it can be used wrong. I do not recall who said this, but someone once famously said, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And I think we can take this perspective on labeling as well, that all labels may not be wrong, or they might be right, but and none of them might be right, but some of them might be useful. And moreover, like, it's not just a problem of high-level tasks that require pragmatic reasoning. This is also an issue for core NLP tasks and for core machine learning tasks. For instance, how we choose which part of speech tag is the correct part of speech tag for a given word is influenced by the linguistic theory that it relies on. Similarly, how we choose to classify an image, whether we choose to say, well, a computer is a computer or a computer is a MacBook. Both of these things are true, but they encode some previous reasoning that we need to make sure is clear. And this, I feel, brings us quite nicely to both the issues in modeling, but also the future directions. And so the issues in modeling, we try to and the disembodiment of in modeling, we try to theorize as a spectrum of models. So on one hand, we have the globalized models. So these are models that only use data from the data sets that they are provided. And then we have the localized models who try to localize a specific datum within the situatedness of its creator. So if a queer person uses the word queer or gay, identify that or try to identify that it is a queer person saying that, and that we should apply different reasonings to it than if someone who's not queer said or called someone gay. And the reason we call these perhaps a bit unintuitively global and local, where the local are the ones that we actually want to get to, and the global ones are the ones that we want to get away from, is by virtue of how the models operate. In the globalized models, what they do is they take a data set and then they try to make a decision on this using the entire data set. And the entire universe of the model exists in that data set. So in that terms, it ends up being a global perspective on it. Whereas the local perspective on it is to say, well, we will treat a specific datum in the context of something external. And so the external part here is what is how we can start addressing these things of embedding data within the context of who the people creating them and the people who are affected by it. And this can be done through either transfer learning or multitask learning, but it can also be done through semi-supervised learning. So in semi-supervised learning, we have the notion of co-learning and tri-learning, and we have the notion that we can take several perspectives on the same data. And I think one way that we can start addressing some of these issues is by looking more generally on, well, how can we use different perspectives and different labels for the same data to see how the model should, to give the model a more informed idea of what's going on. And to get to hate speech and future directions, I think the future work should focus on thinking more critically about who we decide to give voice to define what is hate speech and what is not. Thus far, we've primarily given external adjudicators that definitional power. The question is if we should not try to ask the people who are directly affected what they believe is hate speech and then work backwards from there. I also think that we need to think more critically about data representation, so we don't just have the surface level forms of what is hate speech and the surface level forms of the documents that we're looking at, but we can get a richer representation of what these documents actually encode and what it means for a document to be hateful or what it means for it not to be hateful. And finally, I think that we need to be a lot more clear about what our data is talking about and which populations it speaks about. And that was it. Thank you.
Great. Now we'd like to open it up to questions, and if people could just call out your question, please. And I will start with a question, which is, so if we go out to the communities to get their own opinion of what counts as hate speech in that context, how do you see that as, what techniques do we need so that we can operationalize that so that will be rapid and scalable?
So I think the first thing to do there is sit down with them with some documents that, or like some things that are abusive towards that community, and be like, well, or that you think are abusive, and toe that line and say, well, where do you find that the line is being drawn, and is there a line to be drawn in these examples at all, or are they all hateful towards our community? So, and then through that process, iteratively develop guidelines for what hate speech is and what hate speech isn't.
Yes, I have a question about that, sort of following on the previous question. So it seems like there's a lot of a large degree to which construct validity really is important here. In other words, we really want to know that we're measuring what we think that we're measuring. And I can imagine a situation in which one, for example, surveys a community regarding whether they interpret something as hate speech, and that survey itself is then hacked or trolled, which would of course be problematic. So I guess my question is you're dealing with a construct that has a sort of a fundamental deep uncertainty about it. How do you sort of thread the needle between, on one hand, measuring something like this, and on the other hand, essentially saying that it's, on the other extreme, something that's maybe entirely in the eye of the beholder. You mentioned that there's a majoritarian bias, but any group at all that makes up more than one person will sort of have a majority. So how do you decide on what the boundary is? How do you decide at which point this is a boundary which is not subject to bias, and this boundary on the other hand is?
So I don't think that you can make a decision on something I don't think that anything can be not subject to bias. I think it's and I'm just gonna rephrase, or like repeat your question as I'm hearing it, and please feel free to correct me. But the question for me is that, well, how do we distinguish between which bias we want to put into it, and how do we create the demarcations of what goes into it then? And like, for what bias we want to put into it, I think that is a question that I'm not that happy to answer, or not that happy to give an answer to. I've been arguing for a while that I think would be incredibly interesting to see a data set for hate speech marked up by far right folks. And I'm not saying that it's going to be useful for labeling something as, or for a machine learning model to be able to label something as hate speech or not, and being used in a real life setting. But it would be incredibly interesting to see what we can learn about these communities based on that. But in terms of what bias to select, if I am to try to give an answer to that, I would say let's start by going to communities that are marginalized, and that then also starts to begin to come to a second question of how do we choose which majoritarian bias to take. I think the question here needs to be is which community we choose to center, because you're absolutely right in that as soon as we move beyond one person, there's going to be a majoritarian bias of some sort. There's going to be a majoritarian position. And that's not necessarily an issue as long as we focus our modeling efforts and our efforts towards saying that there's a specific community that we want to be particularly involved with, or that we want to center, and then other communities are naturally going to be to face residual harms from our centering this community, but we need to go through this in an iterative fashion and say, well, these communities are all communities that we care about, and we're going to go out and meet with. And so for practicals, I would say, for practical advice, I'd say, well, there's a bunch of community organization in a lot of different marginalized communities that you can reach out to, and like there are youth clubs and stuff like that where you could actually go and where you could contact to folks, like some of Kathy McEwen's work did, where Kathy McEwen, Desmond Patton, I think, they went out to communities that in Chicago that were affected by a lot of gang violence or gang-related violence, and then had these communities tag up, well, what was gang-related and what was not, or what tweets were gang-related and which were not. So I think that there's a lot of work that can, or a lot of great work that can be done by through the means of co-creation with these communities. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, I think that does answer my question. Thank you.
We have another question from the audience. So another question for you is, let's imagine that you do go out and you've got these different hate speech denoted by different communities. Is there any reason to think that this same machine learning technique will work on all of them, and hence there'll be some form of generalizability? Or do you think everything will be so distinct that we'll even need different techniques per community?
I think that there will definitely be, you'll definitely be able to use the same general architecture, but you might need to train new models. Unfortunately, I don't think that like people who, or fortunately, I guess, people who utter hate speech are that distinct from each other. Like, for instance, from like a South Asian perspective, a lot of the anti-Black comments that I see in a South Asian context are not inherently different from the anti-Black comments that I see in like a European context, or some of the anti-Indigenous comments that I've seen around in North American context. Like there are definitely some differences, and it might be necessary to like tease out some small particularities for each community. But I think the general structure can remain the same.
Good. All right, and then so which communities are you going to be collecting data from?
So for the work that I'm going to do once I fully join the Digital Democracies Institute, we're going to focus on talking to some of the Indigenous communities in Vancouver, BC, or in British Columbia. And we're going to think a lot of what we're going to be focused on is both the production and identification of counterspeech. So we're slightly sidestepping the question of whether something is hate speech or not, and focusing more on, well, how can we bring these issues of hate speech and being faced with it into a question of how we can aid these communities in, or how we can aid these communities or completely alleviate them from responding to it.
Okay. And then, and to what extent are you seeing the hate speech as being, how would you describe the difference between hate speech and the use of abusive language?
So I tend to like the internal model of the and that I have of these different categories is that abusive language is the general umbrella label for all these different kinds of harms. So like that also includes like grooming and things like that. So yeah, I mean, it can be very different, but it can also be it is very much the same just by nature of being an umbrella category. I think if we ask the question of offensive language versus hate speech, which I think is what you're meaning. I don't think that there are massive differences. We just need to, I think one of the things we need to think about more critically is how we respond to it. And I think that limiting our, like modeling it is, in my experience, is not that different between the two categories. But figuring out how we respond to it, I think, is an interesting way, or is an interesting question that I want to try to think more about, because I can throw a bunch of models at some data, and they will perform with some accuracy, and they will be right for some certain percentage of the time. But the question then to me is, when they are right and something is either offensive or hate speech, well, how do we then react to it? Going from a US perspective, just going like there's a very strong free speech tradition in US legislation and US law. So removal of hate speech in itself is a fairly controversial thing to do, which is not as controversial externally or in many other parts of the world. So what I think is actually happening there for me is that there's a lot of space to think more carefully about how we deal with hate speech and abuse. That is not just removals.
Do you have another question out there? Anyone else? Okay, well, I asked all the questions that were sent to me in the chat and the email. So I want to thank you again very, very much. And we really appreciate this, and best of luck with your new career also.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. It was really great.